If February 1763 was a month of suspended animation, a time when the British American colonies were locked in the silent, frozen grip of a little ice age winter, then March 1763 was the month of violent awakening. To the 18th century American, spring was not merely a change in the calendar, it was a resurrection. For 3 months, the colonies had been paralyzed. The great rivers, the Hudson, the Delaware, the Potomac, had been sealed with ice thick enough to bear the weight of oxen. The ice had severed the arteries of the empire. It had stopped the mail, silenced the newspapers, and trapped the merchant fleets in their slips. The colonies had been deaf, dumb, and blind to the outside world. So in March, that ice finally broke. The sound of March 1763 was the sound of groaning rivers, the cannon fire crack of fracturing ice sheets, and the roar of floodwaters. But it was also the sound of a society revving its engine to a dangerous red line. As the harbors cleared, a frantic energy seized the population. Merchants who had been bleeding money all winter long scrambled to launch their ships. Farmers rushed to prepare fields that had been frozen stone hard. Soldiers marched out of their winter barracks to occupy the vast new territories that had been ceded by France. This chronicle today is exploring this month of March 1763, a 31-day period defined by a singular, intoxicating, and dangerous emotion: hubris. The colonists believed that they were entering a golden age. They believed the defeat of France had removed all threats to their existence. They believed the opening of the seas would bring unlimited wealth, and the opening of the West would bring unlimited land. They were wrong on every count. In March 1763, while the colonists looked optimistically toward the horizon, the three great tragedies of the coming decade were quietly taking shape in the mud of the spring thaw. The economic crash that would radicalize the merchants, the smallpox epidemic that would terrorize the South, and the Native American conspiracy that would set the frontier on fire. This is the story of the month when the British Empire in America was at its absolute physical peak, just moments before it began to unravel. So in the first week, we have the Great Release. Here's the physics of the thaw. The first week of March was dominated by the sheer physical violence of the weather. The hard winter of 1762 to 63 did not end gently. It ended with floods. First, you had the Delaware breakup. In Philadelphia, the ice that had served as a bridge for wagons suddenly fractured. The Pennsylvania Gazette reported chaotic scenes on the waterfront as huge, jagged plates of ice driven by the current smashed into the wharves and threatened to crush the hulls of ships that had been wintering in the harbor. Then you had the joy of the mud season. As the snow melted, the colonial road network, which was, let's be honest, rudimentary at best, dissolved into a quagmire. Travel by land became nearly impossible, just as travel by water was also pretty much impossible. This isolated the inland towns even further, creating a sharp divide between the maritime world, which was waking up, and the interior world, which was still hopelessly stuck in the mud. Then you had the flaxseed fleet and the economic surge. In New York City, the first week of March was defined by a specific commercial ritual: the departure of the flaxseed fleet. See, this is a commodity. Flaxseed was one of the northern colonies' most critical cash crops, exported primarily to Ireland to support the linen industry. But then there was the crisis. The winter freeze had trapped the fleet in New York Harbor. Warehouses were bursting with rotting seed. Merchants were facing ruinous losses if they missed the planting season in Ireland. And then you had the release. As the Narrows finally cleared of ice in early March, the harbor exploded into activity. Dozens of ships, their crews hastily assembled from the taverns of Lower Manhattan, raced to catch the tide. This was not just trade. It was a rescue mission for the colonial economy. The release of the fleet brought a flood of relief to the city's merchant class. who had been leveraging their credit to the breaking point during the idle winter months. There was also the insurance gamble. While the ships sailed, the coffee houses of Boston and Philadelphia were gripped by a high-stakes financial drama involving maritime insurance. Here was the context. Everyone knew that the war was over. The Treaty of Paris had been signed on February 10th, but official ratification had not yet arrived. So here was the dilemma. Insurance underwriters were still legally entitled to charge war risk premiums, which were often 10 to 15% of cargo value, until the peace was official. If a merchant paid the premium on March 2nd, and the official news of peace arrived on March 3rd, he had wasted a fortune. But if he sailed without insurance and was taken by a lingering French privateer, well, he'd be ruined. So here's the atmosphere that created. This week saw shouting matches in the London Coffee House in Philadelphia. Merchants accused insurers of price gouging, calling them bloodsuckers for charging war rates at a time of peace. This resentment against financial intermediaries was a microcosm of the larger resentment building against British financial control. So in the second week, first we have the information lag. By the second week of March, the phantom peace had settled over the colonies. The Treaty of Paris was the worst kept secret in the Atlantic world. Captains arriving from the Caribbean confirmed that hostilities had ceased. French officers in the West were already packing their bags. Yet the Royal Proclamation of Peace, the legal document that turned truce into law, was still floating somewhere in the Atlantic mail packet. We also had the Havana hangover, the geopolitical debate that had raged in February. The swap of Havana for Florida began to settle into a grudging acceptance during the week. First, there was a shift in rhetoric. In early March, colonial newspapers began to pivot from complaining about the loss of Havana to extolling the virtues of Florida. There was even talk of a new Garden of Eden. Suddenly, land speculators began to market Florida not as a swamp, but as a potential paradise for rice, indigo, and silk. This was the eternal optimism of the American speculator. If you can't get what you want, then just hype the hell out of what you have. Of course, there was also a simple strategic reality here. The Boston News Letter published essays analyzing the new map. The consensus was that while the trade terms were bad, the security terms were magnificent. For the first time, a British ship could sail from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico without passing a single hostile port. The colonists felt enveloped in a warm blanket of British naval supremacy. Of course, that can also lead to a false sense of invincibility. It is impossible to overstate the arrogance of the colonial mood in mid-March of 1763. Part of this was just based on the fact that the French are gone. The removal of France wasn't just a political victory, it was a psychological exorcism. For 150 years, the papist enemy to the north had been the boogeyman of colonial nightmares. Now, that boogeyman was dead, but there was also the consequence. See, this victory created a paradox. The colonists had needed Britain to protect them from France. With France gone, the bond of fear that held the empire together, well, it snapped. In March 1763, the colonists felt safer than they had ever been, which also emboldened them to be more critical of British authority than they had ever dared to be. They did not yet know that the British ministry, seeing this safety, was already calculating how to make the Americans pay for the war that achieved it. The third week of March led to the pestilence and the mob. You see, in Charleston, which had become unfortunately a city of death, while the North celebrated the thaw, the South was fighting a war against biology. By the third week of March, Charleston, or Charlestown as it was still called, was in the grip of a terrifying smallpox epidemic. Here was the vector. The disease had arrived on slave ships from the West Indies and troop transports returning from the Caribbean campaigns, which then, of course, led to the lockdown. The South Carolina Gazette paints a very grim picture. The city's social season, usually the highlight of the Southern calendar, completely collapsed. The wealthy plantation families fled to their country estates, leaving the cities to the poor, the sailors, and the enslaved, which highlighted, of course, the pest house. You see, on Sullivan's Island, the quarantine station, which was called the pest house, was overwhelmed. Yellow flags flew from the masts of incoming ships, signaling infection. This had an obvious economic impact. The epidemic paralyzed the rice trade. Planters refused to send their boatmen into the infected city to load ships. The rice fleet sat idle, not because of ice, because of fear. This highlighted the fragility of the Southern economy, which was entirely dependent on the movement of human bodies, both free and enslaved, that were vulnerable to the microscopic allies of the empire's recent wars. In Boston, a different kind of fever was rising. March 18th is the anniversary of the repeal of the Stamp Act, but that was years in the future. In March 1763, the tension was local. First, you had the gangs. Boston was dominated by two rival laborers' gangs, the South End and the North End. Traditionally, they fought ritualized street battles on Pope's Day, which was November 5th. But then you had the evolution. See, in March 1763, town records show increasing concern about the lawlessness of the waterfront. The post-war economic slump was beginning to bite. Sailors were being discharged from the Royal Navy with little pay. Dock workers were finding fewer ships to load as military contracts vanished. So what was the significance of this? Well, these unemployed, angry young men congregating in the taverns of Boston's North End were the raw material of the revolution. The men who were brawling in March of 1763 would, within 2 years, be organized by Samuel Adams into the Sons of Liberty. The muscle that would eventually intimidate stamp distributors and tea-ships was currently flexing its biceps in localized street fights, just waiting for a cause. The last week of March brought us to the frontier betrayal. Here was the occupation. The most consequential news of March 1763 was happening far from the printing presses in the deep forests of the Midwest. This was the month of transfer. First, there was the handover. British detachments were finally reaching the distant French outposts, Fort Miami in Indiana, Fort Otanon, and Fort Michilimackinac in Michigan. And here was the visual. Imagine a column of redcoats, their uniforms stained with mud, marching into a log fort where the French fleur-de-lis was being lowered for the last time. It looked like victory. It was actually a trap. So let's consider Amherst's fatal error. The architect of the coming disaster was General Jeffrey Amherst, the British commander-in-chief in New York. Here was his policy. Amherst despised Native Americans. He viewed them as wretches and beggars. In March 1763, he doubled down on his orders to the frontier commanders. No gifts. Shockingly, this led to cultural misunderstanding. To the French, giving gifts like blankets and muskets and brandy, that was the rent that they paid for using Indian land. It was a diplomatic necessity. To Amherst, it was bribery. So he just cut the budget, and that ultimately led to the powder ban. Most devastatingly, Amherst restricted the trade of gunpowder and lead. He wanted to prevent the tribes from making war, but he failed to realize that the tribes needed powder to hunt. By cutting off the supply in early spring, when winter stores were empty and game was returning, Amherst wasn't keeping the peace. He was starving the population. So ultimately, the conspiracy ripened. See, in the villages of the Ottawa, the Delaware, and the Shawnee, March 1763 was the month of decision. First, there were the war belts. Runners carrying wampum belts, which were coded diplomatic messages, were moving silently through the forests. The message from Pontiac, the Ottawa war chief near Detroit, was spreading. The British seek to destroy us. They treat us as slaves, not brothers. We must strike now while they are weak and few. But there was also, unfortunately, an air of deception here. You see, French traders lingering in the villages poured gasoline on the fire. They whispered to the chiefs that the French king had not surrendered, that a French fleet was coming up the Mississippi, and that if the Indians attacked, the French would join them. But for the time being, there was just invisibility. The British officers in the forts saw nothing. They reported sullen behavior, but no overt threats. They were blinded by their own victory. They assumed that the tribes were too awed by British power to even dare a revolt. They were unaware that the date for the uprising was being set for the first moon of May. So here was the texture of life in March of 1763. First, there was the Consumer Revolution. A scan of the advertising columns of the New York Mercury or Pennsylvania Journal in March 1763 reveals a society obsessed with British goods. With regard to the imports, as the ships arrived, merchants advertised fresh goods from London, crimson velvets, Staffordshire pottery, silver tea services, and the latest novels. But this also fed into an identity. You see, to be an American in March 1763 was to be a consumer of British culture. The colonists did not want to be separate from Britain. They wanted to be more British. They wanted the china, the tea, and the fashion of London. This consumer desire is critical because it explains why the non-importation agreements, or boycotts, of the later 1760s would be so painful and so powerful. The colonists were addicted to British trade, and breaking that addiction would require a massive cultural trauma. There also was a religious landscape to consider. March was also a time of spiritual fermentation. The Great Awakening had cooled, but its embers remained. For example, there was the New Light Challenge. You see, in rural parishes, itinerant preachers were challenging the authority of the established clergy. They preached that personal conscience was superior to hierarchy, a theological idea that mapped perfectly onto the coming political idea that personal liberty was superior to royal decree. There was also the Paxton Warning. In the Pennsylvania backcountry, Scots-Irish settlers were growing increasingly radicalized by their perceived abandonment by the Quaker government in Philadelphia. Though the Paxton Boys massacre was still months away, that would happen in December of 1763, the rage was building in March. These settlers felt squeezed between the savage Indians and the pacifist elites. This East-West tension was basically a microcosm of the internal American conflicts that would run parallel to the external conflict with Britain. As March 31st, 1763 faded into April, the British Empire in America stood like a blind giant. It was powerful. It had crushed its enemies. It controlled the map. Its ships were filling the harbors, and its soldiers were manning the ramparts of the West. But it was blind to the three realities that would destroy it. First, it was blind to the debt. Parliament was currently crunching the numbers in London, realizing that the only way to pay for this magnificent empire was to tax the very people who were celebrating it. Second, it was blind to the West. The British believed that they had conquered the Ohio Valley, but they didn't know that Pontiac had already effectively unified the tribes against them, and that the forts that they were marching into in March would be burning by June. And finally, they were really just blind to the American soul. The British saw the colonists as grateful children who would do as they were told. They failed to see that the war had matured the children. The Americans of March 1763 were battle hardened, economically ambitious, and deeply attached to their own autonomy. So March 1763 was the month the ice melted, allowing the river of history to flow again, but the current was faster and far more dangerous than anyone on the banks even realized at the time. The colonists were paddling toward a waterfall, convinced that they were sailing toward a sunrise. The great wait for the peace treaty was almost over, but the great war for the soul of the continent, the American Revolution, well, that was just beginning to form its first unseen clouds.